Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Caring for the Caregivers, Cultivating a Culture of Collective Care. My name is Leora Wolfe. Welcome to my living room. Here, I'm based in Los Angeles. And I think that many of you are a short drive away. So grateful to be in conversation with you this morning. I see around me a lot of light. I can see the bougainvillea outside my window. I can hear the lawnmower in my neighbor's lawn. And all of these things are helping me feel a little bit connected as I connect with you through a computer. And of course, ideally, we would be in person to be able to really think and reflect and connect around what it means to really cultivate a culture of collective care for us as educators. So just want to name that. So again, my name is Leora. I use she, her pronouns, based in Los Angeles. And I'm here with you as from the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. So welcome. If you're just joining us, it means that you're either coming from one thing or coming from another thing. And so I just want to offer you, I hope that you can see I've got my water. I've got a cup of coffee next to me. I want to welcome you. Really hope that it feels like we are in my living room together and being able to think about what it means for us to be able to get the support we need from ourselves and each other, not only in this moment, but also always, right? So the kind of frame that I've been using is always and now. So welcome. Again, I'm going to say the title one more time because I know that we've got some folks coming in. So if you are with me, you are with Leora, with Caring for the Caregivers, Cultivating a Culture of Collective Care. Apparently, I really like the letter C, and alliteration. So welcome. And if, again, you are just joining us, I just want to name that I'm coming to you from shelter in place in Los Angeles. So you'll hear some noises from my environment around me. Cool. So we're going to move forward. I'm going to just name that because I'm coming in from the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, which I'll tell you about in a second. We are funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. So I have to offer this disclaimer. Consider yourselves disclaimed that we are supported by SAMHSA. Of course, this work aligns with SAMHSA, but it is not only of SAMHSA. And if you are new to us, this is the slide that evokes a lot of tiny font fear. So I just want to say, all you need to know from this slide is that we are a national network of centers to provide no-cost TA. So that looks like presentations I'm doing now. In the other reality, it looked like in-person trainings. It looks like resources and coaching and consulting all around supporting the school mental health workforce. And we define the school mental health workforce as anyone who's connected to schools and anyone who has mental health. So that's really all of us, and particularly school district leaders, systems leaders, teacher educators, school social workers, psychologists, students, our school mental health workforce, and of course our family and community partners. So the 9 in the bottom left-hand corner is your region, our region, and I'm the school mental health lead for it. So we support the school mental health workforce of the Pacific Islands, Hawaii, Nevada, Arizona, and California. And this is coming to you from us. So we're welcoming you if this is your first Pacific Southwest MHTTC event. And I will give you all the information at the end of how you can connect with us to get much, 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 much more content related to this conversation and also more. So a couple norms before I tell you a little bit about me and what brings us into the conversation. So this is not the ideal learning space, right? If any of us are educators, we know didactic learning is not always the best, but it is what we have right now. And so I'm just really going to invite you to use the question box as much as possible to be giving feedback, to offer questions, to offer reflection. I will offer a couple moments throughout our hour together for us to use the question box as the chat box. So I think that's where I'm gonna move into our next slide. Okay. I do want to say thank you to Lourdes, who is our conference manager, and of course Beatrice, who many of you know for Fearless Leadership. So both of those folks are my kind of virtual team right now. If you have technical questions, please let them know and they will help you. And as related to content, I also will be able to support you. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, what brings me into your world and your world into mine. So as I mentioned, I'm the school mental health lead for the Pacific Southwest. I work for an organization that does work in the intersections of behavioral health, mental health, education equity, and racial justice. I got my teaching credential from Mills College in Oakland. I don't know how many of you are from the Bay Area and made yourself down to San Bernardino. And I also was involved in a lot of youth organizing when I was in the Bay Area. And what brought me into this conversation is that when I was working with particularly a lot of juniors and seniors in high school, shout out to our high teachers who might be in this space. When I was working with the young people, we had 4 of the young people who I worked with killed due to gang and gun violence 2010. And the loss of my students and our students thrusted many of us into conversation around what does it look like for us as educators to lose students, and who helps us as we navigate student loss. And so with that question, I realized that there wasn't a lot of folks doing that or holding that conversation. And so I came to LA to do my doctoral work on the impact of student death on teachers. And from there is how I've expanded my body of work thinking about consent circles of care. How do we support school leadership to show up to schools ready to lead, educators to show up to schools ready to educate, and students to show up to schools ready to learn. So that concentric circle of care. And I'm naming grief at the onset because I know that this moment, many of us are holding really wide ripples of the grief continuum. Some of us are feeling like really acute grief because of personal loss. Some of us are feeling anxiety and sadness and maybe anger about pandemic life. Moving forward. And so I just name that. And I also want to recognize that many of you are in this conversation today, knowing or not knowing what your work reality might look like. And that knowing or not knowing really is a container for the conversation around collective cultures of care. So I just want to offer that you might engage in this conversation really thinking about this moment sharply, or about larger climate and cultures of how we do our work moving forward. And thank you for the shout out to the Bay Area that I just saw show up. Okay. I also know that I get a little bit talky fast when I'm excited. So if you do need to slow down, feel free to just say, please slow down, Leora, in the chat box, and I will, I'll make sure to be able to watch your body language. Okay. So hopefully you can see this is the sticky stuff meme or whatever it is. I want to this is literally an image of how I feel in this moment. So I want to ask you in the chat box or in the questions to put, do you feel more like the babe on the left covered in the stick? Or do you feel like in this moment, the babe on the right, kind of mischievous and innovative and maybe a little subversive with how you are approaching your work-life experience? So I'm going to say that question one more time. And you can just put left or right. So I'm going to get left or right. Okay, so some of you are saying sticky. I feel like things are happening to me. Absolutely. Yes. Let's see if I can see more. The baby. Okay, so far we are all feeling the baby on the left. Some of us are feeling mischievous on the right. Very cool. Okay, awesome. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. So a little bit more lefts than rights, but that is a good pulse check of where we all are. Keep them coming. Here's the deal. We can feel both in one moment. I know for me, especially in the dual pandemics of both COVID-19 and the acuteness and aftermath of experiencing a collective witnessing of racial violence, that I have felt in one moment like the babe on the left and in one moment like the babe on the right. And both are okay, and both are completely understandable in this moment. So when we're talking about creating cultures of care in our classrooms and in our districts and in our school, in our counties, we're actually going to be really thinking about how do we approach this, knowing that some people feel like things are happening to them, and some people are feeling really like they've got the peanut butter in their hands. And I will say this before we move ahead. There's usually no right way to do self and collective care culture building, a lot of not great ways. And many of us know the not great ways before we know the right ways. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means moving forward. So thank you so much for letting me know where you are. And I also really appreciate, one person said it also depends on the specific area. I want to help as well. So some right? So again, we might be feeling both and. Great. Okay. We're going to move ahead. So I'm also going to ask in the chat box to take, or in your questions, chat box, but in the questions, if you can take one moment, and maybe some of you want to put it publicly, and maybe some of you just want to take a moment to write it down or just to think about it in your head. But who in this moment would you like to thank for guiding you? Who in this moment would you like to thank for guiding you? It might be a colleague, it might be a former colleague, it might be a writer, it might be a student. So I'm going to see if there's anyone who'd like to put in your questions to actually really affirm and acknowledge someone who is guiding you in this moment. So for me, I really want to say that the Instagram handle of the NAP Ministry is really guiding me in this moment. I don't know how many of you follow the NAP Ministry, but the NAP Ministry asks us to remind us that we need rest. And I know for me, I go on hyperdrive when I'm stressed out. And so I need someone to help guide and remind me to rest and restore. Okay, so some of you are saying you've got religious and spiritual gratitude, you have partner gratitude, family and friends, current and former director. We've got some yoga, mind-body practice. We've got friends and colleagues and not blood family, but blood family. And many of you are also talking about really thanking supervisors, which is really great. Like, yes, let's call in the supervisors who are not just supervising us, but are also helping us guide, right? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yes, the NAP Ministry is what it is called. It's just the Instagram handle. I'm not promoting it. I'm not getting paid by them. I'm just telling you that's who is helping me in this moment. Okay. So thank you for continuing to put down who is helping guide this moment. Some of you are putting apps in, which is awesome. I'm seeing the Calm app, which is a great app to use. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. All right. So part of creating and continuing to build trauma-informed practice, which this is a part of, is making sure that when I'm saying self and collective care, and when you're hearing self and collective care, that we're speaking the same language, that when I say something, it lands because we're working from shared definition. How many times in our school cultures are we saying the word trauma-informed or trauma, and one person thinks it means one thing, and another person means something, or we say the word equity, and one person thinks it means one thing, another person thinks it means another. So part of this is to really make sure that when I say self and collective care, we're clear about what I am, how I'm framing this conversation. Okay. I'm sure that all of us have heard the adage, you have to put your oxygen mask on yourself before you can help someone. 100%. That's how self-care is always framed. I am not suggesting we don't start there, but I am suggesting that is not the only story. Because oftentimes, if we are told to do self-care and we don't do it, then guess who feels blamed, shamed, and defeated? The person who needs the support and needs the regulation. And when I mean regulation, I mean the ability to think and feel at the same time. That many of us might be feeling, and our nervous system isn't allowing us to regulate to do some thinking. Or we might be thinking, and our nervous system isn't allowing us to regulate to really feel and connect. So when I'm using the word regulate, that's what I mean. Thinking and feeling at the same time. So not only putting our oxygen mask on ourselves, and also, is thinking about what happens if the plane doesn't have working oxygen masks, if the folks who the masks drop down don't know how to use them, if the flight attendants are feeling burned out and not able to help in an emergency, the whole plane isn't going the direction that we need it to go. Right? I hope that you're kind of following my metaphor, right? So if we are talking about self-care, we're also going to talk about collective care, the whole plane structure, the whole plane culture, policies, and practices. I'll give you an example. 5 years ago, I was in an emergency landing at LAX. I don't know how many of you are involved in emergency landings. It's not great to be a part of, but we were coming down. We were literally land. It was an emergency landing, and the flight attendants over the plane said in a very calm voice, as we know, crisis response, you have to keep very, sturdy, steady voice, that we're about to have an emergency landing. And when we get the cue, which means go, we put our heads down between our legs and we hold on to our shins. Okay. So everyone starts crying. There's a lot of praying. Lots of things are happening. And I noticed that the individual sitting next to me, no reaction. I was like, wow, how calm is this person? Really great. That's super calm and regulated. We get the cue. I move down to put my head in between my legs, in between my shins, and I noticed that the person has not done the same. And so I looked at him, and he looked at me kind of quizzically, and he started to sign, indicating that he was deaf or hard of hearing, and that he hadn't understood what was going on. Right? So that moment I will never forget, because it's not enough to say, put your oxygen on. We have to really think about how are we taking care of individuals who will have the highest need, and set the bar from there to then take care of the rest of the plane. Okay. So I'm taking a breath because I get a little bit energized and passionate about this. So I want to go through a little bit about why we even in our worlds as educators or as humans have come to use the word self-care at all. Where does this term even come from? And why are we using it in schools and in our school communities? So again, you'll have all the decks afterwards. And I want to say too, that this is from me and a couple of my colleagues. This is our own sketch, but you might have your own mapping out. And your own adds to the history. So I really welcome you in the question box. If you have additions that you would like to put in, please let me know so that we can make this collaborative. So the idea of self and collective care, if we go a couple decades back, pre-1960s and 1970s, the actual term of self-care was started by the medical community, by primary care particularly, in the idea to really help patients own their own health practice. So they weren't just coming to the doctor's office to get health care, but that actually when they went home, they were doing all the preventative measures in order to take care of themselves. They were eating well, they were taking their medicine, they were walking. And so the self-care actually came into the idea of health ownership, which is kind of an interesting concept for us as educators. Oh, I am so sorry. The man was fine. He put his head down. We all, no emergency, no one was hurt. What an important piece at the end of the story. So sorry. Thank you for the person who asked what happened. Yes, we are all fine. I did, of course, give a particular airline some feedback about ways to manage crisis response. Okay, back to the 1960s and 1970s. So self-care, this idea that we own our health. It's a partnership between medical professionals and us as individuals. So I want us to kind of take that metaphor as we start to think about what that means in our own teaching and education and school leadership practice. Vietnam, of course, changed the game in our country. So all of a sudden, there were psychologists, there was both population and psychologists that were really understanding that there was a large population who was coming with deep stress and deep wound and deep complicated grief. So the idea of burnout and traumatic stress actually came up right after the Vietnam era, and that the helping profession, human services, in post-Vietnam, started to notice that they were experiencing transference, or they were experiencing vicarious grief or vicarious trauma from the patients they were serving. So Vietnam really changed the game when we think about mental health and we think about those who serve others and what it means to be in a transformational relationship, not just transactional relationship. If we move into the 1960s and 1970s, so now here we are. Self-care is now part of the kind of like industry. It starts to grow as into the 1980s and 1990s and in the wellness industry. So now we're all doing the Jane Fonda leg kicks. We are understanding that exercise and wellness is an important part of our practice. And I want to be specific that PTSD and this idea that without attuned and systemic care, that there is a prolonged experience of folks who are experiencing need comes up. So we start to see that in the 2000s, where we really are understanding the complexity of needs, both of someone experiencing the thing and someone supporting someone experiencing the thing. Okay. In 2001, post 9/11, we are having a resurgence of understanding the impact of mental health and the impact of grief as a whole society, and also attuned into specific cultures. So post 2001, we see a lot of opened interest in really talking about mental health, and particularly talking about self-care as we think about those who were impacted by 9/11. And I want to just name a couple other things before we get into some collective care. A couple other things that were monumental for us as educators: Columbine, Virginia Tech, and Sandy Hook. Of course, more, but with those three, we start to see a higher validation of the impact of the needs of our students, and then how that might translate into an experience of violence and suffering. Sandy Hook was a monumental move for most of us because for the first time, the country saw teachers using their bodies to shield students. And that was a really big aha, that we can't just support our students, we also have to support the teachers who support the students in the self-care. I also know that you in San Bernardino have experienced your own one-time, chronic, and community experiences of violence, and you might have your own history of how the term self-care has mapped out. Of course, this year is going to be fundamental in how we are talking about self-care. So I'm curious, I'm going to move into collective care, but please in the question box, and I'll read some out as we move forward. I'm really interested to hear, how do you think that 2020, this year, is going to change or has changed our definition of self-care? Okay. So I'm going to move forward, and then we'll have time for a little bit of unpacking and discussion. Okay, that was self-care. We're moving into collective care. So I want to be clear that pre-1960s and 1970s, this idea of interdependence, that my welfare and my wellness and my ability to access care depends on your ability to provide and access care. So that interdependence is built on generations and centuries of cultures and communities in the faith-based worlds, in ethnic and other cultures that really identify with this idea of interdependence and collective, that health is based on the collective, not on the individual, and that a lot of our teachings are in the States, particularly in the United States, around what collective care looks like is really learned from immigrant narrative base and also indigenous cultures. In the 1960s and the 1970s, we start to see actually massive political movements to understand that health Self-care is collective care, and they cannot be divorced, right? So in the 1960s and 1970s, we start to see health reclamation activism, meaning I can't trust the system to provide specifically for disenfranchised populations, so I'm going to need to provide for my own community. We also see the peer support model. So this is where Alcoholics Anonymous and a lot of other peer support models start to develop. Again, my wellness, my care. 1980s and 1990s, I want to pay homage to the AIDS and HIV movement, particularly this activism that, again, the system is not listening to us, so we will have to care for ourselves. And through that advocacy, we'll change the system. And in the 1990s and 2020s, we're here in this world of advocacy of healthcare reform, of the mental health peer movement, and of mutual aid collectives. So some of you might be like, well, what does this have to do with schools? Everything, because particularly, of course, in this last decade, we've seen that schools are seen both societally and felt and expected to be the platforms for everything. The platforms and the holders for school-based health clinics, the platforms and the holders for the welfare of families and communities that we serve. And so what that means is for us as school district leaders and as educators, we cannot end the conversation only talking about self-care. We have to also talk about collective. Okay. So I'm going to quickly review where we are with our definitions, and then get a little bit of feedback about where you think we are and how this is landing for you, right? So when I'm using the word self-care, I'm not talking about kale and pedicures. I'm speaking very specifically about the person in the ecosystem who has regulation tools, the ability to think and feel at the same time, self-reflection and attunement skills. Ooh, I'm feeling dysregulated. What can I do to get back online? And feels like they can take action for their own needs to be communicated, met, and heard. So it requires us to be skilled in boundary, in communication, and also trust that when we voice, we will be heard. What does that then mean? Who's hearing us? The ecosystem, the collective care. So that means that the dominant culture centers interdependency and interconnectivity, and how that shows up is our practices and our policies. So at the beginning of COVID, we saw a lot of companies and businesses, mine including, say, stay home if you feel sick. Well, that's a self-care adage. The collective care would be, and here's how we are going to expand your sick day policies in order to make sure that you feel like you can do that, right? Both and. Okay. So I just want to name and be really clear that, and I really love this quote from Brianna Wiest, who says, true self-care is not salt, baths, and chocolate cake, although I have been doing a lot of that during the COVID. It is making the choice to build a life that you don't need to regularly escape from. And that often takes doing the thing you least want to do. So we know that sometimes care means involving ourselves in anti-racism conversations because racism is a school mental health issue. That might mean that self-care is really sitting with a hard conversation with a colleague about a harm that you experienced so that the wellness of the adults in the system can improve the wellness of the young people system. I'm going to pause to see if you might put, and some of you are already doing that, one takeaway or one aha that's resonating with you right now. So some of you have said, this has changed my perspective, and maybe that means that the year where it's very important to take care of us first so that we can help others. Some of you are saying, yes, it takes a village to raise a child. That's what collective care means, both I think in schools and also in the medical community. And some of you are saying school is becoming much more a place to acquire learning and knowledge, and we're being asked to fill in where our families and caregivers may not be able to. So a village now more than ever. Beautiful. All right, let's hear some more ahas or takeaways. So you might just say, yes, okay, I'm going to stop. Someone said both and. Thank you. So whoever that person is, you're joining me in the movement to stop saying self-care only. We say self and collective care. And if collective care is a little bit too, is a term that isn't really jiving with your culture, figure out another term that will indicate it's not only about the individual, but the organizational. So some folks say self and organizational, right? Okay, let's see more. So there's some good resonance with the definition and the explanation of regulation. This idea of really thinking about how does this land both in our personal and in our professional lives. Whoever that person is, kudos to you for even having between personal and professional at this point. I'd like to learn from you. We have someone is saying anytime we purposely discuss self-care is as important, a reminder to do it frequently and often. Yes, so sometimes we need the permission and the reminder. So sometimes someone is saying the need to actually care for me. I don't do that now and we'll have to. Okay, so we'll talk about a couple strategies to do that moving forward. Someone is saying, where's the chat box? There's no chat box. As I said at the beginning, I'm just using the word chat box, but I really mean question. So it's that putting in the question box to whoever wrote where's the chat box, just put your thoughts there. And a couple others, and then we'll move forward. It's confirming for me that if I don't continue taking care of myself, I can't take care of others properly. Beautiful. And also my invitation is for you to then think about how your team and culture and school and takes care of you, right? So a lot of resonance with the self-care and the ecosystem and the quote landing. And that self-care is not just about the physical. Wonderful. I just took a breath, inviting you to do the same. So we're a halfway point. We're going to talk about, this is usually the point where some of you who are not really about the theory get a little antsy because you're give me the things that I can do. So we're going to move into that a little bit. All right. So if we're talking about self-care, then we also want to figure out what stress might mean for us. And I'm using stress as a container. Stress might mean stress related to grief, stress related to a trauma, stress related to hurt, stress related to suffering, or stress related to the structures of the environments that we live in. A lot of our school cultures are stress dependent, both positively and toxically. So this is from Gabor Mate. If you do not know Gabor Mate, I very much encourage you to get to Mate. He is one of the biggest thought leaders in the last couple decades who helped us as a culture understand that behavior is a symptom of an unmet nervous system. So it is not enough to talk about a young person's suicidal ideation. We must interrogate why and how that young person is feeling like not living is more worth than living and what we have to do with that. So Gabor Mate offers us this definition of stress: a response to any threat or to any perception of threat, most commonly to the perception that something the organism holds to be necessary for its well-being is going to be taken away or withheld. I don't know if any of you feel resonant with that particularly in this moment, but this idea that something that we need for our survival and our thrival, which is not a word but should be, is either going to be taken away or withheld. Okay? So that means that when we think about stress, we're thinking about the actual stressor, how our system, literal system, our nervous system, our parents' nervous system, our grandparents' nervous system, and the collective nervous system is processing the environment, and then how we respond to that, all three. And the reason I'm starting here is because if we don't actually pay attention to what stress means and looks like for us, we can't actually figure out how to take care of it, both in a prevention way and in an intervention way and in a post-intervention way. Okay. So this comes from, many of you are familiar with this, but this comes from this kind of wheel of wellness. And I renamed it to actions of care and restoration. So feel free to always use models and reterm them once you've got grounding in why the model is helpful for you. So I'm going to invite you to do an eye gaze. There are, let's see if I can do math, 7 kind of orbits of what care and restoration can look like. And I'm going to ask you in the questions box to put which circle do you feel like you are really doing well with yourself and collective care. Like you are doing the exercise and you're allowed to exercise, or you're supported to exercise, or you're doing the spiritual and you're supported to spiritual. So all you have to do is put one word. Where do you feel like you are nailing it with yourself and collective care in this moment? And I'm going to see what comes up for folks. So I will, I'm going to offer my own vulnerable transparency. I feel like I am really nailing it in the emotional, where I am really practicing a lot of forgiveness and affirmation. And that's kind of where I'm concentrating in this moment, in this COVID lineage, where I'm concentrating myself into care. Okay, so we've got spiritual, with spiritual a lot, wonderful, physical, yeah, a couple psychological. We have two financial. I think also because today is when taxes are due. So maybe those two people are feeling like, whew, I submitted my tax returns. So a couple personal. I'm scrolling. Okay, so colleagues, if we were in person, I'm just going to notice not one of, okay, one of you I was going to say not one of you put professional. And then of course, one person put professional. So out of every single person who named what you're doing well, we have a pretty acute need to concentrate or to notice that the professional orbit may not be getting the kind of support that it needs to get, right? And how are we defining professional? Whoever wrote professional, thank you very much for helping me move in my talking points. So professional. Setting boundaries, we're going to talk about that in a second. Leaving work at work, kind of hard to do in this moment, but maybe not hard to do in this moment for those of you who have strategies to do that. Get regular supervision and constructive feedback. Calling out all of my supervisors, guides, mentors, anyone who supports anyone. If you are not offering reflective feedback, which starts with what are you noticing your colleague is doing well and where your growth mindset coaching, then we need to move into that space. That also means that you are taking health and all vacation and sick days without shame. So some of us might be like, I have a really hard time wanting to take a vacation day because I'll get judged by my colleagues, right? That might be a culture noticing point. Okay, great. So of course, the next question is, out of all of these orbits, where would you like to direct more attention and energy? What might be out of balance for all the necessary and valid reasons? And where might you realign some attention and energy? So I'm going to start to see more come in the chat box. And of course, I will be again vulnerable that I am feeling like I need to do much more attention into financial, particularly coming up, hiring 2 people. And I really want to think about how are we hiring new staff and onboarding them in a way where self and collective care is centered. Okay, so I'm seeing some folks saying emotional, some folks seeing the need for professional and personal. Some folks are seeing physical. Yep. Great. More financial. Whoever's out there, we can support each other, being financial accountabilities, financial with uppercase. So maybe we're all there. So as you start to put these in, I want to offer you that oftentimes when I am supporting staff, that I will use this and we'll start to actually locate who on our staff feels like they've got strengths in one area or the other, and how might you be each other's coaches and support systems. It also means that for us in education, sometimes the workplace isn't the place to have all of these actions met. Maybe spiritual is not appropriate at work, or maybe the physical is not appropriate necessarily at work. And so how might you actually start to have explicit conversations around which of these orbs of self-care care and restoration, do you believe should be held? And because we live in the United States, might need to be reconsidered and examined and interrogated to ensure that the other areas outside of work can be met. Okay. All right. So thank you for continuing to put in all these important reflections. I'm so grateful. This is like, y'all are really, I'm like feeling the virtual verve in the room. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So up next are, again, some concretes. So this is from Meachambaum, and Meachambaum studied school staff cultures and communities over a series of years. And these are him and his research team's findings of what practices most support us as school educators and leaders in our wellness, in our self and collective care, right? He's not using that language, but it's connected. All right, so here's what he says on the peer and collegial. So I'm doing this because I'm looking at you as my peers and my colleagues, right? So social worker to social worker, principal to principal, school staff to school staff, district to district. Might mean establishing support networks. What could that look like? What does that look like in your own home culture? What does it look like to seek support from your colleagues? So oftentimes that is the biggest question that I ask when we're talking about self and collective care is, do you actively seek support from your colleagues? And if you don't, why? And usually it's because there's not emotional safety to say, I'm not great, I'm feeling burned out, or I'm feeling unwell, or it's that you tried to seek out and you were shamed or punished or turned away or dismissed. And so you decided you're not going to seek support out anymore, right? So we want to look at seeking support from our colleagues. Instituting a buddy system. So that might look actually like the second piece, which is how to engage in debriefing. So these are formal opportunities to connect with colleagues and make meaning of our work context. So what could that look like? Does that mean that me and Beatrice, we know that every last Tuesday of the month, we have 30 minutes and we have a protocol of questions where we go through and we just listen to each other. It's not a venting session. It's not someone coming to vomit on us. It's actually someone to help us process so that we can be reflective in our practice. That might mean about something that was emotional. That might mean something that was pedagogical, either or. Of course, it also means how to identify where we might need to boost our competencies. So maybe that means I want to learn much more about collective care. District provides that professional development. That's a practice that might support you. Of course, community building. So it's not out of bounds to be relational in schools. We ask that of our students. We should ask that of ourselves. So if you're starting a staff meeting with only to-dos, production, outcomes, products, without taking a moment to ground and connect and get to know yourselves as humans, then we might be missing some of the humanity of the work that we do. And the last, of course, is creating and communicating boundaries informed by needs. So that does not mean no is not a boundary. A boundary is you are welcome to email me from 7 to 9 p.m. because I have to take care of my kids from 3 to 7 right now. And so my work hours will be later. And that is when I can be able to respond, right? So especially in this time, it's being able to have flexible boundaries. I'm going to move into practices that support us organizationally. So this is, again, ecosystem. So that means, of course, encouraging professional development and training. Sometimes some of us will offer opt-in, and sometimes some of us will figure out what trainings folks will need to have to opt out of, right? Particularly that focuses on educators' welfare, not just students. So how often that I hear, come and do a training on supporting students who are experiencing grief. And I will say, I will do that if only you are creating the space that I can come in and we can do work around supporting educators' grief, because they are in relationship, both and. For those of you who are in supervising relationships, we're thinking about scheduling checkups that are not about, again, evaluation task or producing. I'm not asking you to be your colleague's therapist. I am asking you to be human in the work that you do. And of course, you'll see again, boundary. All right. So this might look a little bit more familiar to those of you on the right-hand side might look more familiar for those of you. We just went over the left-hand side. These are called doom and gloom preventers and interrupters. I lied to you. I didn't mean to. The right-hand side is what we went over. The left-hand side is what we didn't go over. And these might look familiar. These are called the doom and gloom stressors. I often hear kind of like an Eeyore, like, oh no, tonality to the doom and gloom. And again, this is what Meachenbaum found about what stressors exist in school and work communities that do not allow educators to access self and collective care. Overextension of work, large percentage of students who have trauma experiences, right? I will put a caveat in there for an anti-racist lens, which means that do not assume that just because your students come from a specific population that they have trauma, but always assume that anyone working with young people in this time, now and always, there will be young people who have high needs that are unmet. And how do we actually support ourselves to understand and make meaning of those needs and then respond to them? It might mean cumulative experiences and exposure. So in my work with educators, we can have a teacher who has never, ever talked about what it's meant to lose students, to have students die over a 25-year experience. And so it might mean actually taking the time. It doesn't matter if it happened 25 years ago, it's still in our nervous system. The absence of peer support and supervision. This is really particular especially when we come into remote and distance learning. So how can you be more attuned into that? Professional isolation. And as you can see on the left, a couple other doom and gloom. So the reason that I'm here is not to like doom and gloom us out, but is to be explicit, because many of us, as I mentioned at the beginning, have a much easier time accessing what we don't want or what we do not want to perpetuate than what we want to build and work towards. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to do a couple minutes. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we are right on target. So we're moving with me, and thank you for moving with me. We're going to do a little bit of practice. Okay, so I'm going to read a Rachel Remen's quote, and I'm going to ask for you to put one word or one phrase that comes up for you that you would like to kind of stay lingering in this quote. So Rachel Remen says, many times when we help, we don't really serve. Serving is different from fixing. Seeing yourself as a fixer might cause you to see brokenness everywhere, to sit in judgment of life itself. When we fix others, we may not see their hidden wholeness or trust the integrity of life within them. Fixers trust their own expertise. But when we serve, we see unborn wholeness in others, we collaborate with it, and we strengthen it. Others may then be able to see their wholeness for themselves for the first time. So I want to pause and see what comes up for you with Rachel Remen's quote. What words are striking you? What words are landing for you? Okay. So we're thinking about this question of serving and fixing, particularly when it comes to self and collective care for ourselves and each other. So what's landing for you? I'm going to wait and see. You can put it in the questions box. Okay. Building relationships and trust, absolutely. In order to serve ourselves and each other in this COVID moment and in always, San Bernardino, the essentials are trust and relationship, absolutely. Some of you are really feeling, servant leadership, great connection, great connection. We're moving away from that term because of the first word, but yes, servant leadership. Trusting the integrity, really finding some resonance in fixing, seeing their wholeness, exclamation point. So I just want to say, I got my Chinchi credential. I've worked in school communities and school districts across the state and now across the nation. We are trained to be fixers. We are not trained to be servers. That's our orientation, both in how we see our students' needs and how we see our own needs. So part of the question is how might we actually transition into coming from a server mindset, right? Where everyone has their own answers, and it's our job as colleagues to create the conditions for folks to meet their own needs with us and with themselves. Yeah, thank you. Healthy reminder for me to struggle against being a fixer, a better listener, and a helper. The words collaborate and strengthen are really coming up for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And that serving is different from fixing, and to honor the student and the peer as is. Okay, lovely. Let's move. All right. So I'm just going to note that I'm going to actually shift from this section, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to invite you into a practice that you can do as a takeaway home. So this is, of course, Brene Brown. Brene Brown we're kind of narrowing in on this boundary question. And Brene Brown says that daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. I mean, I know for myself, it's much harder for me as an educator to say no than it is to say yes. And then when I'm in my yes, I'm in resentment. So how do I start to cultivate healthy boundaries to really kind of move into a state of interdependence as a form of self-care? Okay. So this is a practice that I'm going to invite you to do at home, hopefully maybe at the end of the day or while you're in another session. I don't know. Just kidding. Don't do that while you're in another session, or do that, whatever you need to regulate. This is a protocol from the National School Reform Faculty, NSRF, harmony.org. They come with lots of protocols to create healthy staff and healthy climates. And the invitation is that balance and boundary, that sometimes we are trained to create to-do lists, but that's about production. It's not actually about understanding our needs. So the first practice is to time yourself and take a minute and write out all the things that are stressing you out, right? On my top 2 list right now, I've got dishes in my sink, and my parents have a kind of mixed approach to shelter in place. Sometimes they're honoring it and sometimes they're not honoring it, and that is stressing me. So then you take all the things that you've listed under what's stressing you and you start to plug them in. What are the things that in this moment, if you addressed them, they might get taken care of? We know that control is a construct. It's not really real, but it helps us feel efficacious in a time when we're feeling overwhelmed and powerless. So control, I can do my dishes. Punto. In the influence, you put the things, the stressors that you might be able to tend to. You might be able to have a conversation. You might be able to address, you might be able to inform, but you're going to let go and know that someone else is their own person, and systems, other things. So I have influence over my parents' choices, but I may not have control over them. I may have influence over the way that the district might have policy regarding the fall because I have voice and choice, but I know that I may not have control. Or if I do have control over that, then I might address it. The last ring is the harder one, I will say, for all of us, which is the concern. What are things that are stressing you out that you're deeply concerned about, but that you might acknowledge that you don't have control over or you don't have influence over? And name those, right? I have concern for many of you digitally, but also my colleagues who are now having to think about childcare as educators in the next 6 months, particularly in Los Angeles Unified and San Diego Unified. And I have concern over teachers who are having to contemplate their lives and their welfare, and a lot of fear that they were navigating. So that's a concern. It doesn't mean that it's going to get taken care of. It just means that I visually am going to help myself regulate because I'm going to acknowledge it. So this is a practice that you can take home with you. Last, but no, semi-last, before we move into closing, this comes from Alex Vanette. She's a trauma-informed teacher educator out of Antioch University. I really recommend that you look her work up. She's in the references and resources section. And what she says, she comes up with great questions around role clarity and boundaries for trauma-informed collegiality, particularly in schools. So I'm going to read them out, and I'm just going to ask you to think about which questions land for you. So she says, if you're in a conversation, which all are, what is the purpose of your conversation with this colleague or student about their mental health, trauma, or struggles? So if you are talking to your colleague and you say, how are you looking to fix them, or are you looking to listen? Next question. Am I the only caring adult that this student or colleague has identified, and who else could I connect them with? So we're not everyone's savior, We need to work and operate in a network. If you are an educator, is there a social worker you can connect a student with? If you're a social worker, is there a trusted educator you can connect a student with? I'm going to go to the upper right. How do these conversations support or detract from our purpose of our time together? Particularly in a high stress time or a lot of time of uncertainty, a lot of our conversations can stay in kind of the wild, like lots of worry. And so we want to make sure that the conversations are really centered on the control or on the influence, or if we're having a conversation about what we're concerned about. Down below, is the student or colleague stuff bringing up anything for me? Am I identifying strongly with them? Am I feeling the need to save them? So that's a question of my relationship with this. And then lastly, am I attending to my own mental health needs? I have this printed out right in front of my desktop because they are questions to help me remind of my own boundary and my own purpose in all of the spheres, in the collective and in the self-care ecosystem. Okay. So we're moving into closing. Here we are. And I want to just offer as we close that, that I have stopped asking people, how are you? I instead am really taking from these kind of living justice press restorative practice questions. So when you might ask a colleague, what are you proud of in your response to this difficult time? Or what is this moment meaning to you? Or what's a source of strength for you at this time? And these are all really good reflective questions to build and bridge collegiality and connection without being each other's therapists, without feeling like we have to own the other person's response and do something, but that we can create places of holding space for one another. Okay. So here are the homework questions. I'm not a homework human, but this is the proverbial homework questions. What would it feel like if your team had a culture of self and collective care? What would be different? What would you be doing more or less of? How might you respond to others' requests differently? How might you make requests differently? And how would you make regulation, relationships, reflection, and renewal a priority in your team? Not just the output, but the input and the intraput. Okay. So I just want to remind us again that we are talking about concentric circles of care. If we want students to arrive to school, virtual or other, to ready to learn, then we have to support teachers to arrive to school ready to teach, and school leaders to arrive to school ready to lead. It is concentric. That's all the circles. Self-care is not on the teacher. Self-care is also on the district, on the state, on our country, on our society ecosystem, right? It's a both and. So I just want to name as we close out, and I really, I'm so grateful for all of your attention and deep participation, that our center, we just came out with a new school crisis suite of tools. So we have a guide to school crisis, school mental health crisis readiness, response, action, and renewal. That is a beautiful compilation of stories of resilience and connection. So feel free to download that. We also have 2 Wellness Wednesdays coming up for the remainder of the summer. So join us, no cost, July 22nd. That's next week, and August 5th, and we'll continue them throughout the year. You have all of this in your deck, so I'm just moving quickly so that I can get to the thank you part. Of course, please follow us, sign our newsletter, sign up, follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, Facebook, all the things. And if you have any follow-up questions or needs or ideas, visit us on our website and our email. And I just want to name before we close, that I also offered a lot of additional learning resources on educator mental health. So I'm just going to move through them. These are the ones that I trust. School employee wellness-centered organizations and initiatives. I also put a lot of the reading that I concentrate on, recommended reading, and recorded webinars and online courses to support your learning. So I'm going to move back to close. Thank you. I see that we are almost at time, and I'm just going to ask you, I'm going to move here. And I'm going to ask you in the chat box or in the questions, to put one word or take our time together, and I will read them out. I know many of you have to transition, but I am here with you. So I'm seeing thank you for engaging and being educative. Thank you. Thank you. Agreed. Thank you. I'm getting a lot of affirmation. I'm so glad. I'm curious about your learning. So we've got 30 seconds. Your learning. And actually, as you're putting them in, I'm going to just move us to our contact information. Okay. So I again am so grateful. All of you are being so you're being so generous. Thank you so much. I'm wishing you a rest of the day of self and collective care. My name is Leora, Pacific Southwest MHTTC. Go San Bernardino, and we'll be in conversations soon. Thank you.